Good morning and welcome back to day 3 of the CogX Festival. My name is Anushka Sharma and I am your virtual MC of the Planet and Smart Cities stage. I am the founder of Naught, an innovation and space technology consultancy, and it is awesome to be back with you today. Earlier today, we had sessions held in our hybrid stage taking place at King's Cross. So thank you to the team and all of our speakers who have been joining us in person. And thank you to everybody who's been tuned in. So good morning, good afternoon, and indeed good evening, wherever you might be tuning in from. This, as I said, is the Planet and Smart City stage. And I'd just like to introduce you to the concept of the stage and what we're sort of covering by way of content, if by any chance this is the first time that you've joined us. So it's all hands on deck at a time in the fight to preserve our planet. With COP26 climate talks in November, great headwinds are building for real progress. From clean transport energy transition, adaptation and resilience, nature-based solutions and finance, we're digging into some of the hottest strands of climate technology. This is the stage to join us to hear about the hydrogen decade and how AI can unlock energy networks and open up forest and farming carbon markets, and how the most inspiring artists of their generation are spreading the climate action change message. So with that, our next session is all about reinventing the high street with geospatial and place-based innovation. And I'm delighted to welcome our moderator for this session. Her name is Laura Foster, and she's the Program Manager of Technology and Innovation at techUK. Welcome, Laura. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to CogX for inviting me to this session today. So as just said, my name is Laura Foster, and I am the Program Manager of Tech and Innovation at techUK. For those of you who don't know, techUK is the UK's technology trade association, and we use and work with technology to empower businesses and people through collaboration and innovation. We have over 750 members from all across the tech sector, 2/3 of which are SMEs. And if after this session today, you'd like to learn a little bit more about techUK, then please do not hesitate to reach out either on Twitter or LinkedIn, or do feel free to reach out to me directly. This session today will specifically explore how geospatial data or location-based data can really help local communities build back better after the aftermath of COVID-19. We want to understand how location intelligence can help prioritize sustainability, health, and resilience, and make the high streets livable for the communities that use them, and make sure that when we are building back better, we are not excluding any form of vulnerable communities in that local area. techUK have been, for the last 6 months, running a geospatial data campaign, looking at how emerging and transformative technologies can better utilize geospatial intelligence. So throughout the conversation today, we want to be emphasizing what the role of the tech sector can also be in pushing forward geospatial adoption for local communities. Now, I am absolutely delighted to be joining the stage with 2 wonderful speakers, starting with Ed Parsons, who was the Chief Technologist from Google, and also Vanessa Lawrence, who is the Director at Location International. Ed, should we start with you to give you a moment or two to introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here at CogX. I'm Google's Geospatial Technologist. I was fortunate when I joined Google nearly 15 years ago now, quite a long time to be at Google, to create my own job title. It's always a great conversation starter. My job under normal circumstances is to spend most of my time outside of Google talking to organizations who we might partner with to obtain new types of geospatial data, developers who are building new innovative applications, and perhaps a less glamorous side of my work, working with standards organizations that put together the nuts and bolts, the infrastructure that makes geospatial technology such a fundamental part to many of the services that we use in a day-to-day business. And as we will talk later on in this session, it's kind of fundamental to this move towards, localism and creating the new high streets, creating new local communities where technology plays a really important role.
Thank you so much, Ed. And Vanessa?
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm absolutely delighted and very excited to be part of CogX this year. I, like Ed, have worked in geospatial all my career, starting off actually in the Earth observation world and moving very much into the whole analytical world at a later stage. Today, I basically advise governments, very large organizations, and intergovernmental organizations in geospatial all around the world. I'm very lucky to be one of the lead advisors for the World Bank. Prior to that, I worked with the United Nations, being the founding co-chair of the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. And for 15 years, I led Britain's National Mapping Authority, which is called Ordnance Survey. And I was lucky enough to take it through its whole path from basically having digital data, which most people thought was to make paper maps better, through to it digitally underpinning the whole of the British economy.
Thank you so much, Vanessa and Ed, and I am so grateful to have the opportunity to join the stage with you both today. So before we get started on deep diving on some questions around geospatial data and the UK high streets, I think it's important to set the scene for our attendees on kind of what the geospatial data landscape is like in the UK and how we go about not so much the technicalities of data mapping, but what that's kind of used for at the moment. Vanessa, I think this might be a good question to start with you on.
Absolutely. Well, in England, Scotland and Wales, we are incredibly lucky because mapping effectively started unbelievably in 1791. And that was with the founding of Ordnance Survey. And it's that data that today underpins everything you see in Google and in Apple Maps and in many other applications. But what we call that data is foundation data. And Ordnance Survey started to turn it digital in the 1960s, and today make 20,000 changes to that master map of Great Britain every day, very much reflecting the change we see on the ground when we see a garage, perhaps a garage block being turned into a block of flats in order for planning permissions to happen. So we here in Great Britain are incredibly fortunate, and I'm sure Ed will agree, we are one of the best mapped countries in the world with accessible foundation data that is available to our citizens and that is as up to date as anything can be when it's collected in the digital world. And it's that that's assisting us to be, as a nation, such a leader in this area.
What a formidable history of geospatial data, which is still so important for all of us today. So moving a little bit further on to 2021, Ed, maybe you can give us a bit of a brief overview as to how geospatial data is now being used by local communities.
Yeah, I think building on what Vanessa said, I think the big change that's probably happened in the last decade and is now accelerating is a lot of the geospatial information that we collect, the infrastructure, that foundation has moved from things that are physical, hard infrastructure, cables, pipes, buildings, to being much more about people, and where people are moving through cities, the choices that people are making, how they're traveling, where they're choosing to spend their free time, where they are working, and it's becoming increasingly real time. So you hear a lot about smart cities and smart city applications. For me, the focus about smart cities is about the citizens, is about the residents, about the people that live in the cities. And that shift has been, in some cases, a little bit behind the scenes, but it's been quite fundamental in terms of the products and services that are now part of living your life in a city. Today, I guess if you're perhaps being brave and traveling back into the office, or you're maybe going out to make the most of your ability to go and have lunch at a pub, you'll look at how public transport is operating, you'll look where congestion is, you'll look at what's the the quietest route, as opposed to where you might be having to sit close to other people, using real-time information that is available to you on your mobile devices. And that same infrastructure is powering all sorts of new services that take activities that might happen at a particular place, a restaurant, for example, and creating delivery services around those that people have been very keen to interact with over the last 18 months. So it's a shift, I think, towards the people, away from the physical infrastructure.
Exactly. And so a lot of geospatial data these days is all about empowering people, but do you think everyday citizens are aware about how much they're using and utilizing geospatial data, and is it being conveyed to them well enough? So Ed, you're nodding, and Vanessa, you're shaking your head. So Ed, I'll go to you first.
No, well, I'm nodding because I think it's a great question to ask, because actually people aren't as aware as they really could be. Well, maybe they are at a relatively superficial level. They'll install an app and recognize the app has asked for their location, and perhaps then not think about it after that. But the location data is fundamental to the way many of these applications work. You think about that joy perhaps sometimes of just seeing the Deliveroo or the Uber Eats driver on his way from the restaurant to your house. That's a great experience. It improves the user experience, but of course it's powered by geospatial technology. The fact that you can pick up an Uber in 2 or 3 minutes in central London is fundamentally because the Uber knows where it is, and your location is being shared when you try to acquire a new Uber. That connection between location technology is fundamental to the way many of these services operate. But I think there's a really strong point, and Vanessa will probably talk about this more, is that it's a superficial level of understanding. And as a result of that, there are some important ethical concerns and issues about how that data is shared that, if we had more knowledge and perhaps a better education around this, some of those questions might be a little less controversial for people.
Vanessa, do you agree?
Well, very much with everything Ed has said. And, I always, during the pandemic, I've been doing a number of talks for schools and for people who are struggling a little bit and in various things, and often kind of literally call it, your world in disguise. Because, we are a bit like the chip inside our computers, and inside our phones and whatever. We've no idea, or the majority of us haven't any idea what's going on. And then actually it all works. And geospatial is so fundamental to so many decisions people make every day. And, I think it's actually COVID-19 has brought home to people the importance of mapping, the importance of location, and the also highlighted that actually so much can be predicted with locational information. And, Ed and I we've lucky enough to have worked together twice for substantial number of years, both times, as working for the same employer, working in the same team, I hasten to add. And both of us have worked tirelessly to make people understand the benefits of location data. And it's only now, since the pandemic, have a number of people contacted me and said, I now get it, how universal this location data is. Of course, people are always worried about the consequences of, every aspect of people knowing where you are, what happened. And of course, we have protocols in place and ethical constraints, and they are upheld by all of us in the profession. And it's important they're upheld, by everybody.
Yeah, very much agreed with everything you've said there. And in fact, it made me think about how when I was on the phone to my mum a couple of months ago and I was trying to explain what geospatial data was, she was kind of struggling to really understand it until I essentially was like, well, do you know, when you go onto the UK government website and you can see how many COVID cases are in your local area, all of that is underpinned by geospatial data. And she was suddenly like, oh, I see the importance of it now. So I do think we're interacting a lot more with geospatial data and location data since the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to move a little bit further now to looking at how this has actually been used in UK high streets then. Maybe Ed, do you have any examples of how people have been interacting more with geospatial data since COVID-19 in our high streets and local communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a wake-up call for everyone when the first lockdown arrived, and then slowly retail and restaurants and so on were able to open up. Because I think it forced many businesses who had sort of vaguely thought about online presence and the importance of being on the internet as something that they had a vague notion that it was important, but they hadn't really done very much about it. I think as a result of the lockdown, people were forced very, very quickly to turn their businesses into online businesses, regardless of what they were previously. So we saw a big focus on people, even small retail boutiques, small specialist shops, making use of some of the tools in Google Maps, for example, to start morphing their businesses to being online as well as bricks and mortar. And that meant about, obviously offering services online, booking to come to get your haircut, or booking to come and make a restaurant reservation, or actually, selling material online that you could then pick up at another point later on. Or what I was really impressed by, starting to create communities of your customers who you might, if you've had a local shop on the high street, you might have known your local customers and say hi to them as they popped in. Now with these kind of online communities that we're developing in the local neighborhoods around the world, those communities formed online as well, and the tools were there to make that happen. And it was surprising in some ways. I think people are surprised at actually how few existing bricks and mortar businesses on the high street actually had an online presence. And it was something that we were always trying to push, to say it's really important to be represented online. That now is a message that has completely come home, and people are now probably running hybrid businesses where now they can be open and they can trade as normal, but the online part of their business that they kickstarted as a result of COVID is now also an important part of what they do.
100%. Vanessa, have you got anything you want to add on that question too?
Well, very much. I've just seen so many services transformed, and talking to people who own businesses on the high street, they're saying they're now attracting different types of customers that they hadn't seen before, because not everybody was wandering around their high street looking at what was on offer. But once COVID occurred, people needed to find new places. They may have been always sourcing things in their work area, for instance. So I think it's been transformational to businesses. Those that have taken advantage of it have done really well. Those that have still decided to shun it, I think, are going to struggle even more post-pandemic, whenever we reach there.
I think you're touching on a really important point there, that maybe access to use of data and digital services isn't necessarily equal both across the UK and in the world. And that very much links to digital inclusion too. When we're kind of talking about geospatial data, how can we make sure we're also pushing for regional equality in the UK? I understand that's quite a big question. So Ed, I'll go to you first and then to Vanessa.
Well, thanks, Laura. Yes, to be honest, yes, there are clearly regional inequalities within the UK, and a lot of those are about, access to sort of the fundamental infrastructure that we're talking about. As Vanessa said, we're very fortunate in the UK to be a very well mapped country, both through, the public sector, what Ordnance Survey does, but also, the private sector mapping companies, where, everyone is on the map in the UK, which is a great starting point. Now, there are clearly issues around access to technology and access to the online services that we're talking about, broadband proposition and so on. But there's work in progress, I think, driven by government to solve some of those. I would change the scope of that question and say, what about the inequalities more globally? And there are much bigger issues where actually the geospatial infrastructure that we talk about in terms of having geospatial data, fundamentally even having an address of where you live or where your business is doesn't exist in many parts of the world. And that's, I think, where as an industry, we should be focusing a lot of our effort.
Mm.
Working internationally, I completely agree with Ed. However, just to come back to your original question, it's very, very interesting. I think the pandemic will have made everyone much more data-driven in how they analyze things going forward. And I'm really hopeful that there will be, now we've seen the impact of inequality in real stark, everybody's seen it in their lives here in the UK, and seeing where numbers always seem to be going up, that there will be much more infrastructure and faster broadband, faster assistance, faster this into those areas, which hopefully will help that leveling up. But across the world, I work in many, many countries where we're creating the first geospatial infrastructures. And we tend to start with Earth observation data, and then, often working in association with companies such as EDS and others, thinking about how do you help people with that last mile, or maybe last 10 mile inclusion, because they don't have addresses. There is no street names, and we are starting from scratch. There is also huge wariness as to whether this is the government and the state now trying to geolocate you. So there are all kinds of issues that have to be taken into account to assist the population. But so often it comes down to basic land registration. And I've worked in many, many countries where it's been transformational, particularly to the female population, to assist them in drawing out land boundaries for the first time of where they think they farm, and then putting it out to community consultation and agreeing amongst everybody, yes, that's my plot of land. Then I can have a land title, and then, of course, I can borrow to build a business, even if it's a small business of, selling some milk or whatever. But it makes a difference and starts getting people out of extreme poverty.
Of course, and creating the first ever geospatial infrastructure, that must be such a crucial but difficult challenge. Do you maybe have any examples you can share a little bit more? It's fine if you don't, but...
Well, there are many in the world. Let's be blunt. It's not a case of 1-2 places. There are many, many, many places where there, particularly in Africa, in South America, where geospatial information, the best they have is either being created by the military and is hidden from the population, or created by companies, commercial companies, who do make it available, but they may not have the internet, or the most they will have is a few of them having a mobile phone. One of the interesting things is this location data, and Ed talked about it with tracking, being able to track when you turn your app on. But one of the ways that I use that location data is to see where nobody is putting on an app, and then looking from, satellite imagery where there appears to be communities, because that means they've no electricity. That means they perhaps are struggling to access any kind of healthcare and other aspects. So you can use it in a completely humanitarian way, in a completely different way.
Thank you so much for those examples. I think you're really touching on how geospatial data can be used for inclusion there, which is such an important conversation, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to address it just in the time that we have there. We actually do have a question that's come through on the chat function whilst we've been talking. And if anyone in the audience would like to send questions across, please do. You don't want to just hear from me this entire time. I'd be delighted if you have any questions. Ed, this is kind of directed towards you, but Vanessa would love you to come in on this as well. And Remco has asked, how has Google adapted to ethical concerns which has large sections around drawbacks of extracting local data from our phones and apps?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work over the years on this, and yeah, there are some very strong processes that have been put in place over the last sort of 3 or 4 years to make sure that we're very careful about the use of data that comes from people's mobile phones and comes from them living their day-to-day lives via a mobile device. The most important of which is about transparency and about control. And we will we put in place mechanisms now that make it very clear and very explicit when your location information is being collected, and that collection of information is completely within your control. So we make sure that all of our products and services can work when the data is not being collected. It may not work as well. Clearly, an application like Google Maps, for it to work, it needs to know where you are to give you a sense of what's around you. But that data doesn't need to be collected. So there's a fundamental question we always ask ourselves: should we be collecting data? In this case, should we be collecting your location information? And unless there's a really good reason for it, then we shouldn't be doing it. If we do think there's a strong reason for doing it, then we need to be really clear and explain to our users that this is what the information is being collected for, to minimize how that information is used, minimize the amount of information that's collected. And then, once we've used that information for the purpose we've collected it, then get rid of it and, not to store that data any longer. So a lot of it is about, transparency, about control. But I think part of the issue goes back to the earlier point about, actually understanding and educating the user community around this, because it's there's always a balance. Any data that is collected is done for a benefit both of you as a user, and perhaps there's going to be a benefit there for the service provider. But there are also potential negative implications, particularly for unintended consequences. The very fact that you can take a photograph on your phone, not really think about it, but unless you've been quite careful with your settings, the location information of that photograph is embedded within the photograph itself. And if that photograph is then given to someone else, they'll know when that photograph was taken and where it was taken. And there's a particular characteristic of geospatial data, particularly about individual locations, that we need to be really hyper aware of, in that your location in time and space is like a fingerprint. None of us share the same movements around the world in time and space. So we have to be, and we are, very, very careful about how that data is collected and is used. But I think this is a topic of conversation that is probably only just beginning. And the more that we talk about it, the more that these issues are raised, actually the better it will be for all of us, because we shall have a knowledgeable conversation around it.
So obviously these conversations are very much about mutual benefit, but you say that around ethics and transparency, this is only just starting to come to the forefront. Is there maybe any resources or specific communities that you'll highlight people to if they wanted to find out more information about this, or just where these conversations are happening?
Well, I would recommend that people Google a thing called the Locus Charter, which is a piece of work that actually Ordnance Survey partially funded here in the UK, but it's an international gathering of people to come up with some sort of best practice guidelines. And clearly, we look at the ethics of geospatial data within the broader context of how data is used across the web and online services. There are some specific issues with geospatial data, but the Locus Charter is a good starting point to look at, okay, where's the conversation going? Who's having that conversation? And it's quite an open dialogue. It's a very inclusive organization, that's a good starting point for people.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, do you want to come in on that point? We have just had another question asked in the chat, which I'll ask otherwise.
Okay. Well, I absolutely agree with what's been said. One thing we need to think about is, so often people are incredibly concerned about the ethical issues, but there are times when these very large companies are of huge assistance when there's a crisis, when people need to be found, when, I was working in an earthquake area, and we were asking all of the big companies to work with us. And they were fantastic at assisting to find hidden signals and things like this. So at all times, things are very well governed now. They perhaps weren't, 15 years ago, but now they're well governed, and they really can be of great assistance when's required.
It's like what 3 words is a brilliant example of, I think, one of the really great UK success stories where use of location data can be used in times of crisis as well. So I think there is often that angle to take into account. I can't believe that we've already spent 30 minutes talking and we just have 10 minutes left. I feel like there's so much I want to ask you both, because you're both just so knowledgeable about the use of geospatial data. We have had one fantastic question in the chat from Andrew Ward. He asks, with the decline of high streets in recent years, often towns are becoming gutted in their centre. What new types of activity beyond retails and restaurants could come in facilitated by geospatial data? I know this question is a little bit speculative, but Vanessa, is there anything you would like to answer this question with?
Well, I think what we're going to see is a lot more, whereas before on the high street, it was a transactional aspect. You went to the high street to buy something and you came away. And now I think the high street will be much more about services and experiences. And I really do see that they will, if we can get it right, be draws back for people to somewhere where there's a lot happening. But I think it will also be much more specialist than it's ever been before. In preparing for this for today, I was intrigued that close by a very large frontage been taken up by an experience company that's providing, and we may say, what? New coffee and tea experiences from all over the world. And it's all about geography. And it tells you about the geography of where it's come from, how it's been, the work that's taken it right from the fields, how it's sustainable, etc. And apparently they're crowded out because it's a new experience. So I do think there'll be more of that. But Ed may have other experiences and other thoughts.
Ed, before I go on to you and ask that question, another really great question is coming from Peter, which kind of links to it. And he asks, how can we use geospatial data to regenerate high streets? He says in the town where he lives, most of the units are now empty, from older boutiques to former supermarkets. And then he specifically asks, how can we help startup communities with geospatial data reclaim the space? And this is a very important question for me, because the hometown where I am from is very much going through a very similar thing. So Ed, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's complicated. I don't think there are any necessarily silver bullets for this. You look at the high street of the past, it was the efficient way of getting goods and services to people. The perception now is that actually it's more efficient, and certainly from a user perspective, to do shopping online, to get goods delivered to you, so you don't have to make the journey to the high street. I think what Vanessa said is a key part to this, that actually people are now wanting more of an experience, and the lockdown perhaps is also driving a need to go and actually interact with people more, to come together, and not just only entertain visits from the delivery man once a day. I think that focus, that shift will continue. There will be more non-retail destinations on the high street. But I don't think, high street retail is necessarily dead. We just need to change the equation, the dynamic again, to make the high street again efficient as a way of getting goods and services to people. And that might be about, a much more, localized economy, a localized infrastructure, where you might have services, retail on the high street that is, much more focused at the needs of the local community, and that local community being powered by, online. Online local communities are increasingly powerful. They can get marketing and sales drives very, very quickly to local businesses, if those local businesses are aware of what's needed for their local neighborhood. So this hyperlocal approach to retail, I think, has some power for it. It might be perhaps a very middle class example, but on my local high street, there's a couple of businesses now that sell soap and washing up liquid and rice and so on without containers. You bring your own container and you fill your container and you take it home with you. That's a very different type of retail than was there previously. So I think there will be new models. I think the death of the high street is perhaps a bit, overrepresented. I think the high street will change in its nature. It will, perhaps no longer be dominated by supermarkets, but as Vanessa pointed out, perhaps, smaller, more specialized retail. Maybe, the UK high street will come to be much more similar to the high streets that we see in many European, small-sized towns, where it's a much more specialized, more local focused. Each high street feels a little bit different to each other. That's, again, perhaps me being the optimist, but I would like to see that as a model. And I think, it can be powered by technology, because we can build those local markets, those local communities of people that want their local areas to succeed.
Exactly. I think kind of just going off that is the high street is going to be dominated by local communities and by experiences rather than any traditional models. Sorry, Vanessa, do you want to come in on that point again?
Well, I think there's also something that's got to change. I think something has to change, though. One is the commercial model of being part of that high street. We're all saying communities are really important. We also all know that local online communities have become important, and those are powering change. We also know in the pandemic, something different happened, that the council stepped in to assist the businesses to be able to stay trading or to stay in business by reducing the rates and things like that. And if you look at the commercial viability of the balance sheets of these places, one of the biggest expenditures, much bigger than in our households, is the taxes they have to pay for being open. And so I do think there's going to be a change there, because in order for housing to be successful in the area, then people will want these local communities to thrive. But if they're finding that, I was talking to a hairdresser and they were paying £26,000 in council tax. And in order, if you think of the number of haircuts you've got to do per year before you start to get that repaid, it's quite substantial. So maybe that has to change, because they are such a benefit to the community to have high streets, particularly if they are diversified high streets. Would I say the same about yet another Starbucks? Maybe not. But would I say the same about a small shop, as Ed just illustrated, of which they are springing up everywhere, where there's sustainable shops? Might be different.
Thank you, Vanessa. I can't believe we have 2 minutes left, and I want to just wrap up with one more question really quickly. And it's a bit of a future gazing question, but Ed and Vanessa, if you can summarize, how do you both envision geospatial data being used by local communities and to help reinvent the high streets in the coming years? And if you can touch on maybe some emerging technology parts of that, I'd really appreciate it. Ed, I'll go to you first.
No, I think there's a very positive role for geospatial technology to actually balance to level up, and actually I think there's a huge potential to potentially move away from the big online stores and getting stuff delivered to a more local version of that, where local businesses, because of the technology platforms that now exist, can participate and be active in the markets in the same way that the big box vendors are, and do that with a very kind of hyper local focus that will be fundamental to their success, serving very local markets, understanding what the needs of those very local markets are.
Thank you, Ed. And Vanessa?
I think also, adding to Ed's comments, I think we'll also start to see it being used very much to help us understand our carbon footprints, understand our sustainability. Many communities are now doing thermal surveys, and very much all of that will change our behaviors. And of course, with artificial intelligence, it's very quick to analyze now. So I see absolutely great change going forward.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this virtual stage with you. I think there was so much more we could have discussed, and I would love to have picked your brain even further, but thank you just so much for both of you for being here today. And of course, thank you so much to the audience as well for submitting such brilliant questions on this very important topic. I'm going to hand back now to Anushka, who will be wrapping up the session.
Gosh, thank you all so much. Laura, Ed, Vanessa, thank you for joining us here on the Planet and Smart City stage. That was exceptional. I think it's such a timely conversation that has impacted all of our lives during the last year and a half, and indeed moving forward, as you say. So thank you. And again, just to reiterate Laura's comments there, to our fabulous audience, if you're tuned in via the application and you're watching virtually or experiencing the hybrid conversation, thank you so much. We really love those questions and that interaction from you, because that's what we want. We want much more of that. So we really do appreciate that. We are going to be back at 2 p.m. British Standard Time for the COGEX Best Climate Innovation Award. Join us to hear from the shortlisted companies to decide the Best Climate Innovation Award winner. So it's lunchtime. We'll be wrapping up this stage now. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Make sure that you use the networking on the Hop-In app, get some fresh air, hydrate and re-energize. And we look forward to seeing you back here on the Planet and Smart Cities stage at 2 p.m.